late 90s, discussions were going on. We were exploring other parts of what was happening in other communities who were redefining themselves. And it was about in 1999 and 2000 that we actually, finally got together. There were some of the elected officials in the City of Youngstown, some of the business leaders in the City of Youngstown, convened a series of meetings to understand that Youngstown was going to be different. And if we're going to do something about it, it had to start here in the City of Youngstown. Not that it didn't require external investment, external assistance, because it was going to, but this notion of waiting for the future, which actually the Mott Foundation funded a report, and that was the title of the report, Waiting for the Future. The people of Youngstown were waiting for something, some external impetus to come in and make those changes. That wasn't going to be the course of action that was going to ultimately bring a sense of relevance and vitality back to this city. We ultimately, happened to come across what was going on in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and it was called Chattanooga 2000. And it was a process of redefining the city of Chattanooga. They had gone through a lot of changes, and we knew that it wasn't something that you could apply directly here, but some of the principles of that certainly seemed relevant here in Youngstown. We knew that we needed somebody to help guide us through this, but we didn't, buying a high-priced consultant to come in and sort of put a report together and slap Youngstown, Ohio on it and hand it to us wasn't going to work, because the great deal of cynicism and past failures in trying to pursue something like that had left a bitter taste in the mouth of many here in this community. But we ended up hooking up with a firm out of all places, Toronto, Canada, called Urban Strategies. After sitting with them, they understood the approach that we needed to take, that we needed them to help us build a framework, but ultimately this had to be owned by and driven by the people here in Youngstown and in the Mahoney Valley. And out of that started this initiative, which has now become known as Youngstown 2010. It was titled Youngstown 2010 not because particularly because it started in 2000 when we saw just the precipitous decline in population of Youngstown, and we knew that redefining this community wasn't going to happen over the course of 5 or 6 years. It was going to literally take a decade or so. And we didn't want to simply measure our success by population counts, but we understood that in every 10 years we would have an opportunity to evaluate and keep relevant some of the things that we were doing. It was far enough, I'm not really competing with these bells very well. It was far enough out in the future to give us time to start the evolutionary process, but not so far out where people say, well, it's great, but it's, who knows what's going to happen in 40 or 50 years. There was a reasonable expectation that in 10 years we'd still have enough memory of the process and be involved in the process to see our success. Well, we had a series of meetings with people throughout the community, not just traditional business and political leaders, neighborhood leaders. I mean, any and everybody who wanted to be involved was wrapped up into this process. It was almost like a listening tour. Tell us what you think about Youngstown. Tell us what are some of the city's strengths, some of the city's weaknesses. Tell us some of the long-standing problems that you've had, and it was just that. We're not judging at this point. We're not saying that's good, that's bad. We want you to know that redefining this community is going to involve, people who previous to this didn't necessarily think that they would be engaged. That was a series of meetings that we had in the year 2000, 2001, and it culminated in a community-wide planning meeting to talk about the vision and the planning initiative for Youngstown, Ohio. I am not a planner. I was a banker who came to work for the city as Director of Community Development, so I was involved in this from day one, but it certainly wasn't because I was a planner. And if you think about a planning meeting, if you're not a planner, a planning meeting just isn't a real sexy, attractive event. It's just something that maybe excites planners, and no offense to planners, but for non-planners it was sort of, what are you going to do here? Well, anyway, 1,300 people. This was a week before Christmas. It was, a very cold December night, and had we had the, foresight, we probably would have thought to plan it differently, but it ended up where we had this community meeting planned a week before Christmas, and, the cynics and the critics said, if you get 100 people at this planning meeting, you'll be lucky. Well, as it turned out, 1,300 people showed up to Stambaugh Auditorium, which is just 3 or 4 minutes from here, one of the city's historic public auditoriums, and spent 3 hours talking about redefining what this community was going to be. It was a meeting that was planned for about an hour and a half, and again, turned out being a 3-hour meeting. And what we did that night was we processed and synthesized everything that had been discussed and talked about in those previous meetings. Now, we understood that some of the ideas weren't very good ideas, to be honest. Some of them were phenomenal ideas. Some of them were everywhere in between. But people needed to know that there was credibility in this process, and this process was going to be different. And out of that night came 4 basic tenets of the Youngstown 2010 initiative that we are to this day yet still operating under, and they had a great deal of relevance and power as it related to this community. And I'll talk about the four very briefly, and they're not rocket science, but they were things that we needed to come to terms with here in Youngstown. The first one was accepting the fact that we were a smaller city. Well, again, I told you that from the very beginning. We went from 170,000 people at our peak, expected to exceed 200,000, and in what seemed like overnight ended up being less than half of that, at about 75 to 80,000. So the statistics said that, but mentally and emotionally, in the way we governed ourselves, we were still operating as if we were a city of 150 or 170,000. So accepting that we were a smaller city, but also understanding that didn't mean an inferior city. Cities tend to, judge themselves. You're doing well if you've got more people. Well, that's not necessarily the case, and that was something that we had found ourselves caught up in, that trying to just chase, making sure people came back to Youngstown, as opposed to saying, well, you know what, there are many, many communities across the country, across the world that have 70 or 80,000 people. There are wonderful places to be, vibrant places to be. Let's not define ourselves simply by that population number. The second tenet of the Youngstown 2010 initiative was understanding that we had to redefine Youngstown's role in the new regional and global economy. When steel was king, Youngstown was king. Youngstown set the economic agenda. You either got on board or you got run over. That's the way it was. Well, things had changed dramatically, not only in the region, but also in the world. And we knew we still had the ability and the talent and some of the assets to compete, but we weren't employing those things. We were still busy trying to figure out, how do we replace steel? What's the one single industry that we can come and attract to replace steel? And that's not the way the world was going anymore. That's not the way even the region was going. It also meant that there was going to be a great deal of parity and interdependence between Youngstown and some of the surrounding regions. And that didn't sit well, as you can imagine, with some of the old guard, because they were used to sort of calling the shots, and the economics all ran through the city of Youngstown, and Youngstown was the central economic and the most important economic node. Now there were other economic nodes. There were retail economic nodes out in the suburbs. There were other places where industries started locating, and it didn't all run through Youngstown. But we were still very relevant to the regional economy, and also still had the potential to be relevant to the global economy. The third tenet was understanding that we had an image problem. We in Youngstown, some of it self-inflicted, others of it thrust upon us unwittingly, or not because we thought we deserved it. But in order to make this place relevant to the people who were here, and also relevant to the state and to the country, we had to deal with some of the image issues. And that wasn't necessarily traditionally a part of a land use or an economic development plan. But again, we needed this to be a comprehensive redefining of who we were. So whether it was our neighborhoods, or whether it was the educational system, or issues such as crime, we wanted to wrap those up into the Youngstown 2010 Vision and Planning Initiative. And the fourth one was a call to action, a sense of ownership. It goes back to that point that I made of waiting for the future. That this wasn't going to happen because we deserved it. This wasn't going to happen because the guys at the steel mill stuck it to us. This wasn't going to happen because someone in Washington woke up and said, hey, Youngstown's not gotten a fair shake. It's time for us to make them whole. This had to be owned and driven, and the responsibility and accountability had to start here.